think someone's in here with me. Who is it? Mega. Okay. If you guys are here, then I'm going to go ahead and start. All right, cool. This should sound a little bit more clear than yesterday. I finally managed to fix my computer, so let me know if this starts to jack up a little bit, and I can modify some stuff. But otherwise, I think this microphone sounded a lot better than the other one did. Let's see here. Is it still playing? Yeah, give me one sec here. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so aviation instructor handbook, same thing that we talked about yesterday. Just to be completely honest with you, these next two sections aren't going to be nearly as interesting, in my opinion, but they're still useful. And I don't think that we'll go nearly as long as we did yesterday as far as time goes, but we might. So I'm not anticipating it though. So you guys should have this to follow along if you want to, but if not, no big deal. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and find out where we left off. So yesterday we talked about chapters 1 and 2, which were human behavior and then the learning process. And then today I'm not going to talk about chapter 3, effective communication. I think you guys actually communicate fine at this point and you understand how that concept works. So, and also I know the Air Force teaches communication pretty well. Then the teaching process, I believe we're going to be starting there. So chapter 4 is what we're looking for. Hey, Roxanne. Okay, so the teaching process, just kind of going down, I love this. Like, what is teaching? Teaching is to instruct or train someone or the profession of someone who teaches. So, bottom line, that's what it is. I feel like it's kind of silly, but at the end of the day, it's just like every other time we talk about building block approach, where we want to ensure that we start from the basics and work our way forward. So, yep, that's teaching. Based on this book and what it determines, you guys should need to know. It has basically essential teaching skills, things that, well, like it says, research has been devoted to discover like what makes a good instructor. So to kind of break those out a little bit, the first one is people skills. So if you are just not a people person and you don't feel like you like to hang around with people, I would kind of take a step back and reevaluate you being an instructor, simply because yeah, people skills. You got to be able to communicate with people and talk to them. Um, and just like it says here, technical knowledge is useless if the instructor fails to communicate effectively. So if you're just one of those weird, you know, Robux type dudes that has a lot of problems with people skills, then it may be time to reevaluate what's going on. Hey RP, what's up, brother? The two-way process of effective communication means actively listening to the student as well as teaching him or her. So bottom line, you got to be able to communicate with the person. Now, this is interesting when it comes to military because rank starts to come into play. So I highly recommend that you have a conversation with whoever you're working with to make it pretty clear, whether it be you as a sensor operator to another sensor operator, or you as a pilot to another pilot or SO in that manner, or an SO to a pilot. Understanding the boundaries and barriers that exist between officers enlisted and then officer and then enlisted rank stuff. So something to keep in mind there. Moving on to subject matter expertise. So this is kind of where we flourish a little bit at the WIC. We are SMEs in our platform. So we possess a high level of expertise and knowledge or skill in a particular area, which specifically is tactics, I would say. But I would also be willing to say that we kind of venture out of tactics a little bit and just kind of go with just basic knowledge, trying to ensure that everyone is actually knowledgeable of their platform and their sensor and what they're doing to ensure that they understand like what they're talking about. So uh, just like we've had conversations with each other about in the beginning of the week, you guys were saying like you don't feel like you're getting a PhD level of understanding of what's going on here. Well, that's true. But when you compare the knowledge that you have now to the knowledge that you had before, or even the knowledge of the individuals back at your squadrons, you are at a doctorate level for all intents and purposes. So you are SMEs in that regard. Management skills is going to be another huge one for you guys. Management skills generally include the ability to plan, organize, lead, and supervise. For the effective instructor, these skills are reflected in the ability to plan, organize, and carry out a lesson. So this is actually a pretty big deal. So uh, whenever you are instructing the squadron as a whole, let's say you're having like a down day academics or something like that, you shouldn't brush this off as just like, oh, I'm going to go up and give a brief. You should actually kind of invest yourself into what's going on and try to actually commit to it and try to help the best you can to ensure that people walk away from that briefing not just saying, oh, this is a brief from the weapons officer. No, it's a brief of knowledge and information that you are receiving from the weapons officer that they actually need to go to receive and understand. So if you can organize and carry out that lesson appropriately, honestly, you really they should be kind of, the best way I can explain it is, you don't want your student to get enveloped in the idea of being taught by a weapons officer. They should be enveloped by the knowledge that you're teaching them. So for all, the best way I can explain it is, let's say you're driving a car. You don't want your passengers in your car to know that you have brakes. Let's put it that way. So anytime you push the brakes in your car and you slow down, you want to do it very gentle, very light, in case you have, Grandma Myrtle. That's the La Tech reference that was used for all 4 years of my life there. You don't want Grandma Myrtle in the back of the car to even know that you're slowing down. You want to be very gentle, very slight and slow. So same concept when you're instructing. You don't want the students to really know that it's coming from you. You just want them to be very encased in the knowledge they're learning. And it kind of takes away the mystique of the weapons officer and has them kind of focus on the knowledge itself. You should just be a conduit, if you will, and not really focusing too much on trying to be the person that is presenting the material, just focusing on the material. Then assessment skills. So like it says in chapter 2, the learning process, learning was defined as a change in behavior of the learner as a result of experience. So we talked about how what actual learning is. So the assessment of learning is a complex process, and it is important to be clear about the process of the assessment. So there's several points in which the assessment can be made before, during, and after training. So that's pretty obvious, but again, it's one of those things that we have to say it out loud and kind of discuss it and talk about it to make sure we understand that we are focusing on the entirety of the training and not just the actual flying portion. So maybe the pre-brief, maybe the debrief itself by the student on the crew, things like that, things that you want to focus on to ensure that you are assessing their capabilities and understanding like how they function. So the way this book breaks things out is, again, it's for FAA, so it's a lot of CFI type stuff. So here it talks about knowledge tests, oral quizzes, and then performance tests. So knowledge tests, which we'll go over a little bit here in a few pages, but really that's going to be like your PECs quizzes or tests, your pilot monthly, your instrument tests, your semi-annual, things like that. That's going to be your knowledge test. So that's really kind of owned by OGV and training and those guys. Oral quizzes and performance tests, however, are things that you, as an instructor, should capitalize on and try to use to increase the capability of your students by determining what their knowledge level is. And again, we talked about previously yesterday, students who just memorize information will start to break down whenever you start to have them utilize that information in scenario-based training. So if you have a scenario or you have a tabletop type thing, the student will slowly start to degrade in their capabilities of being able to produce that information if they don't actually know it. If they've just memorized it, then they're not going to get very far. So this also talks about instructor code of conduct. We're going to scroll through a few of these because you guys actually have a pretty good idea of this. But essentially, this book is a baseline foundational bit of information, and that's something that I think you guys actually have. So We'll move on to the preparation of a lesson. There is course of training in here, but that's really focused on like syllabi and things like that, and how you're going to outline what you're going to teach, like training schools and stuff, which is not something you guys should be focusing on for this. Preparation for a lesson. Before I go any further, am I coming through clear for you guys? I'm just going to wait for an answer so I can adjust anything before we go to any further. Cool. All right. I see you guys posting that, but I'm just now responding. So I think there's like a 30-second delay of some sort. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started again. So for preparation for a lesson, a determination of objectives and standards is necessary before any important instruction can be presented. So this is key here. This can be your crew objectives, it can be your desired learning objectives, your DLOs, things like that. So take a step back and focus on what you actually want to teach today. So a conversation that can be had is, it would be shocking for a student to create DLOs about what they're teaching after they've designed their lesson, if that makes sense. So before you go in to actually teach something to someone, whether it be on a flight, whether it be in kind of like a mass instruction type thing, like a lecture, you should determine what you actually want to teach, your objectives in that, and then go through and create the material associated with your DLOs. So for training objectives and standards, just for your essay, to let you understand what the terminology is here, civilian aviation world have what's called PTS, or pilot training standards. It's just a little book that they use that kind of dictates the things that they require you to know or understand. They're not nearly as specific or detailed as the squadron standards that we have. So just whenever you see PTS, or pilot training standards, that's what it's referring to. Aviation training involves two types of objectives: performance-based and decision-based. Performance-based objectives are essential in defining exactly what needs to be done and how it needs to be done during each lesson. And then decision-based training objectives allow for more dynamic training environment and are ideally suited for scenario type training. So performance-based objectives, bottom line, you likely can get those just by watching someone take a test or answer questions, things like that. Maybe like an oral exam of some sort, or a verbal exam, so to speak. Decision-based training is really what you're going to see while you are flying with people. So you will be able to see them make decisions. This book refers to it as aeronautical decision making. But bottom line, you need to be able to grade people based on objectives, and you need to have objectives for each portion of the training. So as an instructor, you should not just be walking in saying, I'm just going to go in and watch this guy and see how he does. Now that's okay if you're doing like let's say like a WIC look or instructor upgrade, IPUG look, things like that, if they're on the watch list. But if you were just going to instruct someone in some way, shape, or form, I highly recommend that you have something in your hip pocket to actually kind of hold on to and be able to reach back to if you need to help you figure out exactly why you're there. Because if you're there to just watch, then you're kind of wasting your time, because you should never be wasting the opportunity to instruct someone. So make sure that you take advantage of that time whenever it is available to you. So the way that they break this out is they'll break it out into these like little cards here. What you'll see is like lesson 1. This is a lesson plan, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a couple pages. But the syllabus defines the unit of training, states the objective, what the student is expected to accomplish. So if you ever think about how the student is going to go through an action, these are the things that you want to go through. So if you guys ever taught in the FTU, I know I did, this thing doesn't exist, at least as far as I'm aware. You don't actually know exactly what you want to talk about, except for a very baseline talk about changing headings, or talk about airspace, or SRO. Like literally, I've seen just SRO there Like, well, this actually defines out what you're trying to get the student to do in each lesson, and that's pretty extensive information for each of your syllabi for civilian stuff. So performance-based objectives are used to set measurable, reasonable standards that describe the desired performance of the student. This usually involves the term behavioral objective, although it may be referred to as performance, instructional, or educational objective. All refer to the same thing, the behavior of the student. So bottom line, you want to actually monitor how the student performs away, and then you want to assess how they did, and then you want to compare that to the baseline or the objective or the things that they are expected to accomplish. And that's where the comparison comes in on actually grading them or the assessment. The objectives provide a way of stating what performance level is desired of a student before the student is allowed to progress to the next stage of instruction. So in our case, this would be like proficiency levels. I need you to meet this proficiency level, or RPL. I need you to meet this RPL before you can go to the next block of instruction or to the next phase. That is essentially what that's talking about. Performance-based objectives consist of 3 elements: description of the skill, condition, and criteria. Each part is required and must be stated in a way that leaves every reader with the same picture of objective. So this is critical here. And how it is performed and what's a level of performance. So whenever you're thinking about how ambiguous any type of standards you may have seen recently on what that actually looks like, this kind of indicates that you should avoid that. And then this breaks out a little bit more onto how that is looked at. Description of the skill or behavior, conditions, and then the criteria. So this is an example of what this little die here of what performance-based objectives are actually kind of based on. Give me one sec. Yep, there it is. Okay. So then this talks about PTS. We talked about pilot training standards. So if you guys ever go get your airplane FAA stuff, these are the things that you actually have to follow to actually pass your check rides and stuff. So I just see my entire college life flashing before my eyes with that. All right, cool. So then moving on to decision-based objectives. So decision-based objectives are based on objectives, or decision-based objectives are designed specifically to develop pilot judgment and aeronautical decision-making, or just decision-making in that case. So improper pilot decisions cause a significant percentage of all accidents and the majority of fatal accidents in light or single or twin-engine aircraft. Basically, bottom line, if you have a student that's making bad decisions, that is where you need to grade them based on decision-based objectives. But it's up to you as an instructor to define what that looks like, because each student is different and each scenario is different. So you need to kind of have a broad stroke idea of what you want that to look like for your student, what you want the objectives to be. And then from there, you need to define that to your students so they understand what they're trying to accomplish. And then whenever they try and do the thing, you assess them and grade them and debrief them based on that information. And then other uses for training objectives, more information there. But this right here is really good info. I don't want to go through each little bit, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that it would be a good idea for you guys to go in here and look at this, because it talks about before the lesson, these are the things I want to look for from a student. During the lesson, these are the things I want to look for. And then after the lesson, these are the things I want to look for. Now, I will be shocked. I mean, I will be absolutely just astonished and flabbergasted if any RQ4 training of any sort have actually utilized anything like this, at least to this degree, to what you see on this page here. So moving on, that was 4-8, and we'll keep moving on down here. These next few pages, I'm not going to go over, but they talk about training delivery methods. So like if you're lecturing, so like what I'm doing today, it tells you the things you can do to prepare for a lecture: establish the objectives and the desired outcome, researching the subject, organizing the material, planning productive classroom activities, things that I clearly have done for today. So go me. I'll let you try and figure out if that's sarcasm or not. Types of delivery, reading from a typed or written manuscript. I don't know who does that. Reciting memorized material without the aid of manuscript. Things like that. So just good for information for you guys to go through and look at, but not really the focus of what I want to talk about today. Use of notes, advantages and disadvantages of a lecture. Yep, all those things. Discussion method is another one. And then we'll keep going down. All right, so we're on 4-15. It's where my next set of notes are. Problem-based learning is something that I wanted to kind of hit the highlights on and talk to you guys about. Sorry, give me 1 second here. In 1966, the Macaster University School of Medicine in Canada pioneered a new approach of teaching curriculum based on problem-based learning. There are many ways many definitions for PBL, problem-based learning, but for the purpose this handbook is defined as a type of a learning environment in which the lessons are structured in such a way as to confront students with problems encountered in real life to force them to reach real-world solutions. So this is pretty critical here when it comes to PSATs. If you're teaching in a PSAT or on a local and you have some type of situation for your student, you should try and relate it to the real world as much as possible. So if getting 300 fault to kind of screw your buddy is not really what you're looking for from someone who is flying a real airplane, because it's not super realistic, maybe you don't want to sit there and hammer them with EPs in the PSAT. Maybe you want to give them just enough to watch them run the checklist, because that's what you're actually focusing on, because you can't predict which faults they're going to get while they're flying, but you can help them work through actually running checklists and ensuring that they are successful in the event of something like that occurring. So highly recommend that you structure the way that you teach people to ensure that it is actually real world instead of just kind of I'm just going to go in and just beat this guy in the face with a rubber hose. Developing good problems that motivate, focus, and initiate student learning are important components of problem-based learning. So relate to the real world so students want to solve them. So this is pretty critical here. I would say an example would be if I gave you guys a real world military objective that maybe we'll go and execute in a few years, you might be more motivated and want to solve the problem more than just going and just grinding out the knitter multiple times. So that's an example of something like that. Require students to make decisions. So actually force them to pick one or two. You don't want them to just kind of ride the middle or be very vague on exactly what they're trying to do. You want to make them make a decision. The thing that I was taught whenever I was in pilot training is I, as an instructor, can't teach you to make a decision. I can only teach you to make a better one. So if you are indecisive and you can't just pick a solution fast enough or in a way that will help you move the problem set along or the process along, if you are just indecisive and can't do anything, I can't help you, because that is just you as a person that I'm just not going to be able to focus on. However, if you are making decisions, but you're making poor decisions, then I can work with you, because we can talk about why you're making that specific decision and I can kind of guide you. But I can't teach you to make a decision. I can only teach you to make a better decision. That was something I was taught quite a few years ago. That kind of is residual information that keeps in my head pretty often. So PBLs are open-ended and not limited to one correct answer. They are connected to previously learned knowledge as well as new knowledge. So this is where the building block approach comes into play. They reflect lesson objectives, so you shouldn't just be throwing out a scenario or a situation without an objective of what you want to accomplish. And they challenge the student to think critically. So that does not necessarily equate to difficult. If you have a student who is trying to take their time and actually focus on the problem set and figure out a good solution, that does not necessarily mean that it is just impossible or they can't solve it ever. It's just making them spend a lot of time focusing on all of the details to get the answer. And that'll help create a really good student there, or a really good pilot, I should say. So here we are back at HOTS. Like I said, I've only seen this acronym used in this book. So I don't even remember what HOTS stands for. Let me look that up real quick. There it is. High order of thinking skills. Neat. So basic approach to teaching HOTS: set up the problem, Determine learning outcomes for the problem, solve the problem or task, reflect on the problem solving process, consider additional solutions through the guided discovery, and reevaluate solution with additional options. Reflect on the solution and why it is the best solution, and consider what the best solution actually means. So again, HOTS is really just decision making by your people. High order of training skills, what they're calling it here. But essentially, you're training your students to be able to make a decision when shit hits the fan, and that is what this is focused on. So if you ever, like we talked about yesterday, but if you ever think about people who just hit a mass state of panic or stress and all they do is they fall back on their training. If you ever heard that this is the training that develops those critical skills in the event of a catastrophic event of some sort. So this you, the instructors, are the ones that help build that. And you have to understand how to build that to create those people that can work under stress and actually focus on what's going on. So one thing here is consider what is best in this situation. Your way isn't always 100%. You as the instructor need to go through that scenario a few times if you're building out like an ideal scenario, because you're a creature of habit and you want to use the same scenario for multiple students, which is perfectly fine. Understand that just because you found a solution does not mean that that is the solution. That is just your solution that you think is the best in that situation. However, understand that you are going to run into people, guaranteed, that are going to find a different way, maybe a better way, and that needs to become your best solution at that point, and just keep kind of improving upon yourself. But have the humility to understand that your way isn't always 100% the way to do it. Neato. Scenario-based training, SBT, uses highly structured script real-world experiences to address aviation training objectives in an operational environment. It is a realistic situation that allows the student to rehearse mentally for a situation and requires practical application for various bits of knowledge. Neat. So, if you guys think of the second Beale flight, that would be a structured script of real-world experiences to address the objectives that we were trying to accomplish. So just to kind of give you guys to attach that an anchor point, that is going to be scenario-based training methods. Does anybody have any questions so far? God, such a long delay. I think that's like a full 60 seconds. All right, cool. If you guys have questions, just type it in there in the chat. I will see it, but it may get answered after I've started something else, which is fine. Okay. All right, so talking about scenario-based training methods, a good scenario is not a test. So this is critical. Just like going back and having your student understand that you're teaching them, but there are no repercussions for them doing poorly. Understand that a good scenario is not a test of their skill. It's a way to give them like a way to think critically. The test will not have one right answer, does not offer an obvious answer, and should not promote errors, and should promote situational awareness and opportunities for decision making. So it's very difficult to come up with these scenarios and just like out of nowhere. So I would highly recommend that you guys consider using a real world example to teach a student through some type of scenario. That is a way to like create some type of something to relate it to real world and make it as real as possible. Because if you start creating examples or scenarios out of nothing, they're not going to be realistic. It's just how it is. You may be a blind squirrel and find a nut once in a while and get a good scenario based off of creating it from nothing. But I can tell you from my experience and all the platforms that I've flown at this point that using real world experience is plenty enough material for you to have to teach your student with this specific scenario. Then another one is the case study method. It's a great time to use your own experience, what I have written there. A case study is a written or oral account of a real world situation that contains a message that educates the student. So this is the there I was stories. And this really, in my opinion, a lot of pilots that have learned to fly were taught using case study method. What that means is, the best way I can explain it for the RQ4 is hanger flies. There I was doing the thing, this happened, I started doing this other thing, and this is how it ended. So bottom line, you should do this thing if that occurs because that worked for me. Just an off-the-wall example, I was a student in the T1 and UPT, and I heard on the radio, sitting in the jump seat from another plane that was talking on the radio to another plane in their formation. We weren't even in their formation. Talking about how they had a caution on their panel and they couldn't fix it. And the other pilot told them, well, if you reset this circuit breaker, the galley circuit breaker, the one that we never touch or never use for anything, it actually fixes that warning instead of having to have maintenance, fix it when you land. And I just filed that away as like, oh, I heard your there I was story and, no big deal. Well, no shit. 4 flights later, we were stuck on the ground somewhere, probably in like Memphis or something, and we were getting this fault, this warning. We couldn't clear it. And so I immediately realized, oh, I have a story from someone on how they fixed that. So I was sitting in the jump seat again during that time, and I said, hey, if you reset the circuit breaker, that should fix it. Well, the instructor reaches over, pulls it out, pushes it back again, boom, fixed it, took off, flew the lesson, no big deal. So that is just kind of like a quick example of a case study method that was successful for me. We're going to move on to page 5.3 next. A lot of this information here talks about electronic learning. Keep in mind this book's from 2008, before a lot of this information or a lot of the methods in which we teach today are more prevalent. For example, I'm literally teaching you off of YouTube right now. So some of this is antiquated in my opinion. They definitely should remake this book because it's a lot of good info, but it's definitely antiquated. Talks about using instructional aids, which is not necessarily antiquated. Use them as a helper, not as a crutch. Moving on. We'll get down to 5.8 here. Okay, so chapter 5, assessment. I don't get the meta reference. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, is it? Yes. Yeah, the YouTube. Nice. The YouTube. Okay, so chapter 5, assessment. So bottom line, this is talking about actually assessing your students' capabilities. I guess it was 5.2, not 5.8. Sorry. And so this is where you have to think about how you grade your students. So as it says here, most instructors and students are familiar with the term grading. A more useful term is assessment. Assessment, which is the process of gathering measurable information to meet the evaluation needs. And it talks about Latin. I don't know why we're talking about that, but essentially, in authentic assessment, there are specific performance criteria or standards that the student knows in advance of the actual assessment. So this is critical. You never want your student to go into an assessment, something like a check ride, without knowing what they're going to be checked on. Same thing with a flight. Your student should go in ahead of time understanding what they're going to be graded on so that they understand what they're going to be focusing on while they're flying. So in our case, let's say for the WIC, the practicals, using a case study to teach case studies. Nice, Roxanne. So that threw me off. I gotta stop reading the chat unless you're asking a question. You're just fucking with me now. Thanks. That's fine. I lost the thought. When I come back to it, we'll figure it out. Maybe if I read this again. In authentic assessment, there are specific performance criteria. Oh, yes. Okay. So if you think about how the standards are set up for our WIC, you understand that instructorship, MDS expertise, integration, that you're going to be graded on that. Then if you go in the squadron standards, it explains what that is. Though it's not like super clear, it's enough guidance for you to understand that when I also open up that standard book and I read it, I'm going to read that verbatim, and if you met that criteria, then you pass. Same with the 11-2RQ4 Vol 2, same concept with evals, since I think we're all evaluators at this point. It says, if you do this, you get this grade. That's essentially what that's talking about, knowing in advance what that's like. Now, obviously, there's some gray area because you could Q3 every single pilot on every flight with that book, which is ridiculous. But bottom line, you should never have a student going into something where they can be graded without understanding what they're getting graded on and how to be successful. If that means that you need to meet with the student the day prior or things like that, that's what needs to happen. That's just how it is. All right, purpose of assessment. The assessment is an essential and continuous ongoing component of the teaching and learning process. An effective assessment provides critical information to both the instructor and the student. Both the instructor and student need to know how well the student is progressing, and a good assessment provides practical and specific feedback to the students, including direction and guidance on how to raise their performance level of performance. So, if you've ever done a practical or a ground mission with me, Roxanne, or Bang, you should have gotten some type of feedback that says you are aggressively familiar, and to move up to the next proficiency level, you need to do X. And when you do X, you will then be at the next proficiency level. So just an example of what you should also be giving to your students. If you have a student that's just not doing well on mission planning, explain to them why they're not doing well, and explain to them what they need to do to be better. That way, when they go in next time, they at least have it written down, and they can just do those things. General characteristics of an effective assessment. So this is pretty critical here. This is not talking about check rides. This is talking about you as an instructor working with a student and actually taking the time to figure out how well they did or did not do. They should be objective. So if we're all evaluators, which I think we are, you had to do an objectivity ride. Well, that ride didn't necessarily just pop up for all the instructors that are instructing beforehand. So this is why this is critical to talk about. The effective assessment is objective and focused on the student's performance. It should not reflect the personal opinions, likes, dislikes, or biases of the instructor. Instructors must not permit judgment of the student's performance to be influenced by their personal view of the student, favorable or unfavorable. Sympathy or over-identification with the student to such a degree that it influences objectivity is known as the halo error. A conflict of personalities can also distort an opinion. If an assessment is to be objective, it must be honest and it must be based on performance as it was, not as it could have been. So this is pretty critical here. It must be honest and it must be based on the performance as it was, not as it could have been. So you shouldn't grade someone poorly because, well, if you'd done this, it'd have been better. Neat. That goes up to how I can receive guidance to raise my level of performance. That's not the grade that we're talking about. We're talking about how I actually did, bottom line. So here's my grade. So if you guys are working with someone, even if you don't like them as a person, be an adult, be objective, and just look at their performance. You can have a separate conversation about them as a person, which is perfectly fine and legitimate, but you should be focusing on their performance overall. Then flexible, the instructor must evaluate their entire performance on the student in the context in which it was accomplished. So here is where, in my opinion, the Vol 2 you need to read between the lines and understand that sometimes a good student turns in a poor performance, and a poor student turns in a good one. So it may be it's your right and your responsibility to understand like what the context was for whatever happened, whether it be good or bad, to make sure that even if they did really good on a flight, taking a step back and just saying, did all they do is just change their heading the entire time? Did that make them a really good student because they just did everything right that one time because it was really easy? Or if they did really poorly, were they just being pounded with all kinds of different requests or all kinds of different things just from all different directions that would have saturated even a very experienced instructor pilot? So being flexible and understanding that it should be very flexible. Acceptable. The student must accept the instructor in order to accept his or her assessment willingly. The student must have confidence in the instructor's qualifications. teaching ability, sincerity, competence, and authority. Usually instructors have the opportunity to establish themselves with a student before the formal assessment arises. So formal assessment, I think for that is not necessarily what we're focusing on. So I think that's really like a block check or like a check ride or something. But you can think of formal assessment as how they're actually grading on a grade sheet. So acceptable for this would be if you don't have credibility. So if you're known as the shitbag that walks around the squadron, and then all of a sudden you're the dude that's instructing them, uh, yeah, you can lose your ability for the student to accept your information willingly, um, just in case yeah, it is how it is. I can name names, but I'm not going to do it on YouTube. But just try and think about people that you've worked with that were instructors that you just would never possibly go to ask a question. That is essentially their credibility. If students don't go to ask that specific instructor questions when they need help, then that person needs to kind of take a hint and realize that maybe their credibility is being questioned. Comprehensive comprehensive assessment is not necessarily a long one, which is Jesus. Please note that it's not necessarily a long one, so to speak. Nor must it treat every aspect of the performance in detail. So just because you go through a flight doesn't mean that you need. Sorry, in a debrief, if you're going through the steps of how a flight occurred, you don't need to hit every single detail. You just need to know the broad stroke idea of what occurred during that flight and make sure you cover the big picture items. And then constructive, an assessment is pointless unless the student benefits from it. So praise for its own sake is of no value, but praise can be effective in reinforcing and capitalizing on things that are done well. That really just kind of says it on its own. I don't need to go into more depth than that. And then organized, an assessment must be organized. So think of this when it talks about assessments. These are like the grade sheets and stuff. So if you're using a grade sheet, it should be organized. Thoughtful and effective assessment reflects instructor's thoughtfulness towards the student's need for self-esteem, recognition, and approval. Don't go into a grade sheet and be an asshole and just say, this dude sucks, he needs to be better. Be objective. You're grading their performance. You're not grading the student themselves. It's kind of like how whenever you give a salute, you're saluting the rank, not the person. So you need to focus on their performance and just focus on that, not them as a person. So if they are the one in the MCE that is just releasing flatulence continuously, that is not what needs to go on the grade sheet. Their performance needs to go on the grade sheet. Specific, the instructor's comments and recommendations should be specific. Students cannot act on recommendations unless they know specifically what the recommendations are. So this is critical. So if you don't explain how to do better and be very specific on what went wrong, what went right, and how to improve it, then it's useless. Nobody knows how to use that information. And then moving on to traditional assessments. This is going to be your PECS testing, so I'm not going to go over that. Just understand that that's just essentially what that is. And I think we're almost done with this chapter here. This is going to be very short. I think we've only got actually about 20 minutes left. So, authentic assessment is a type of assessment in which the student is asked to perform real-world tasks and to demonstrate a meaningful application of skills and competencies. Authentic assessment lies at the heart of training today's aviation students to use critical thinking skills. Rather than selecting from predetermined responses, students must generate responses from skill and concepts they have learned. So this is really kind of focused on like a mission check, in my opinion, less on like an instrument check because it's not super dynamic, in my opinion. But think about like how a mission check goes. It's real world. I have to do the thing. I have to respond to real requests. That is essentially an authentic assessment. Collaborative assessment. There are several aspects of an effective assessment. So if you're actually looking at a student's capabilities, these are a few like areas that you want to look at. Replay. Sorry, this is a way for you to assess the student through a collaborative assessment. So basically, it's a chance for you to sit with the student and talk about with the student how they did to try and build up what your assessment of them is. I saw Jester do this with Weapon, I think, and the MTI Practical. I wasn't a fan of it, but it worked well for him. Replay, ask the student to verbally replay the flight or procedure. Listen for areas in which the instructor's perception differ from the student's perception and discuss why they did not match. So this is a pretty critical one here. I had this problem with a student who was on their 2 check for IPUG, and I had them replay to me what they did or did not do, and I was able to use that to tell them and explain to them that they did poorly. I failed them. It was an S&P, but we had a differing idea of what actually occurred. So I used this method to actually replay what occurred so that we were on the same page, but I still S&P'd them. Reconstruction encourages the student to learn by identifying the key things that he or she would have or could have or should have done differently. That's a tongue twister, so to speak. During the flight or procedure. Reflect. Insights come from investing perceptions and experiences with meaning and requiring reflection on the events. For example, what was the most important thing you learned today? What part of the session was easiest for you? What was the hardest? Did anything make you uncomfortable? If so, when did it occur? How would you assess your performance and your decisions? And did you perform in accordance with the standards? And then redirection. The final step is to help the student relate question or lessons learned in the session to other experiences. So this is critical. So we talked about the building block approach, and we talked about the anchor points that those build so that you can take information and anchor it down to each one of those building blocks. This is critical. This is a critical part of that. How does this experience relate to previous lessons? What might be done to mitigate a similar risk in future situations? And which aspects of this experience might apply to future situations and how, and what personal minimums should be established, and what additional proficiency, flying, or training might be useful. So just some questions to kind of go through there. And again, that is for a collaborative assessment. It's you working with the student to discuss their performance. So in my opinion, if you have an aggressive student or one that's very difficult to work with, this is the method that I recommend that you use, because what it does is it forces them to grade themselves, and it forces you to use a Socratic method to explain to them how they did or did not do. If you guys are not familiar with the Socratic method, let me pull that up real quick and explain what that is to you real fast. I just Googled it real quick, but basically, bottom line, I'll post it in the chat there for you guys. But bottom line, if you have an argument, or a student has a belief argument or a way that they thought something went, you can use this Socratic method to make them defend that position. So if they thought they did really well, then you literally can just ask like one question and force them to continuously talk themselves through the processes or the execution of the mission to see how successful they were. So an example of how I use this on Riot, sorry buddy, I'm just going to use you as an example. For Fun 1, he said that he was not going to look for a specific type of ELINT. And so I went through the Socratic method and just said, oh, okay, well then why are you doing this? And it forced him to explain something. And I said, oh, okay, well, why are we doing this? And it forced him to explain why he was collecting on something else, and it caused him to stop and realize that he had talked himself into realizing that his original determination, his original action was not the correct one, or let's say it wasn't the best one. I don't want to say it was the correct one. Wasn't the best one, and I simply didn't even have to actually tell him it was not the best one. I used that method, collaborative assessment, to work that through. So neat. Moving on to maneuver or procedure grades. Describe at the completion of the scenario, the student is able to describe the physical characteristics and cognitive elements of the scenario activities, but needs assistance to execute the maneuvers. Explain, practice, perform, and then not observed. This is all basically just kind of Bloom's taxonomy, things like that, and also for actual physical flying for the most part. I don't know that it really super correlates with us, but definitely go through and look at it and figure out if that's something that might be useful for you guys. I don't know if that thumbs up is sarcastic or not, Riot, but that's fine. 6.2 is the next page we're going to. Moving along. A lot of this is testing type stuff and single pilot mentality type stuff, which we are not because we have a sensor operator. Let's see. types of questions to avoid, things like that. Okay, moving on to chapter 6, which is planning instructional activity. I'm going to pause for questions again here before I move on to the next chapter. I believe this may be the last chapter. I think so. Nope, we got one more after this, but it's not a lot of stuff. All right. Okay, cool. You guys just let me know if you have questions. All right, chapter 6, planning instructional activity. All right, so this one is going to focus on something that you guys have heard about, blocks of learning. After the overall training objectives, your DLOs, have been established, the next step is identifying the blocks of learning which constitute the necessary parts of total objective. Just as in building a pyramid, some blocks are submerged in the structure and never appear on the surface, but each is an integral and necessary part of the structure. Thus, various blocks are not isolated subjects but essential parts of the whole. During the process of identifying the blocks of learning to be assembled for the proposed training activity, the instructor must also examine each block to ensure it is, in fact, an integral part of the structure. Extraneous blocks of instruction are expensive frills, especially in flight instruction, and detract from rather than assist in the completion of the final objective. So I want to make sure I point this out to Roxanne in this book here. Extraneous blocks of instruction are expensive frills, and especially in flight instruction, detract from rather than assist in the completion of final objective. So just keep that in mind. The use of the building block approach. Oh, hold on. So, again, just like Bloom's taxonomy, the building block approach is not a weapons school thing. It's just taught at weapons school. And I apologize to you guys, even though I'm not at fault for you guys having not been taught this, that you have not been taught this up until this point. So think about how I feel as the asshole in the corner that has seen all this before and is wondering why all this is new. So that's my thing I get to live with here. But the use of the building block approach provides the student with a boost in self-confidence, and this normally occurs each time a block is completed. So here's an example of, I think that's more like a honeycomb approach. I think those are honeycombs there. I have my fishing license, Roxanne. It's fine. So if you look at this, this has an example of what you're looking at. So this is, again, focused on like a Cessna 172 learning to fly, but try and just work with me here on understanding what that looks like. So if you look at the bottom, imagine this are the practicals that you guys had to go through to actually understand what those things actually are. Here, this next building block required the practicals for you to do the ground missions that have occurred and will occur for DT1. So we've built up by giving you baseline knowledge and we tested you on it. Then we brought in some actual scenario-based training for you to learn and apply those methods that you have learned. Then from that, we'll work into the actual flights. So you applied it on paper, you applied it on a chart, and then we get to go through and actually apply it on a flight. From there, we'll then go into integration where you have learned about how the sensors work. You've actually drawn on a chart how they should theoretically function and work. You've gone out and you've flown it to prove that it works. And then you'll go into integration having used all those things below you to be able to stand at a table and be able to talk the talk because you have built up yourself up to those points to be successful. That is building block approach. And that is how our syllabus actually defines that. So then it goes into talking about training syllabus, things like that. Oh, sorry. Let me relate this a little bit less on just our WIC and more to you guys real quick. Sorry. I think you guys have already gotten information on this and how it works, but think of this as when you guys go back to the squadron, you need to figure out the baseline thing that you want to teach your pilots so that they know how to be successful from that point forward. If the entire squadron doesn't have this first block of instruction completed, then it will be difficult for you to bring them up for that to that next level. So just keep that in mind when you go back to figure out what the very minimum you need all of your pilots to know before you can start teaching them the next thing. So to give you an example of how the 12th actually kind of found this out, but I don't think they really found it out the way that they realized. They wanted all of their pilots to read one WIC paper a week, I think is what they said. The problem is that immediately put them at this third tier right here. And what they realized is a lot of their pilots didn't even know really fully how to fly the airplane and all the regulations that were focused on that. So they were asking their guys to learn how to employ before they even knew how to actually fly the plane. So they took it a steps back and they just said, all right, you guys just start reading up on just flying the plane and we'll slowly and methodically move up from there. So that's an example of what that looks like in real life right now. Syllabus format and content. So training syllabus. I'm not saying that you guys need to make syllabi for your squadrons when you go back, or even the group or the wing. But I would definitely have an outline of where you want your pilots to start so that they have an idea of training on where you want them to start and where you want them to go. And then as a squadron or a wing or even just a group, you can all move together towards that month after month. All right, we're just scrolling through down. These are all like syllabus stuff. And then, okay, lesson plans. All right, this is going to blow your fucking mind. Lesson plan is an organized outline for a single instructional period. It is necessary. It is a necessary guide for instructor because it tells what to do, in what order to do it, and what procedure to use in teaching the material of a lesson. Interesting. So, the purpose of a lesson plans are designed to assure that each student receives the best possible instruction under the existing conditions. Lesson plans help the instructor keep a constant check on their own activity as well as their students. So what this does is, if you're going in to teach someone something, I would say either in the FTU or even not in the FTU, this cages your instruction and doesn't have you just going, oh, look at this, oh, look at that. Now that's dynamic instruction in some cases, which is perfectly fine, but your entire flight should not be focused on that. It should be, I'm going to hit these things one after another. Here's how I'm going to do it, and here's what I'm going to focus on. So characteristics of a well-planned lesson essentially break out into a few different categories. Unity, content, which these aren't highlighted. Hold on. Killing it. There we go. Unity, content, scope, practicality, flexibility, relation to course training, and instructional steps. So I'm not going to go through each one of those, but you guys can go back and read those, page 6, 7. But bottom line, whenever you create a training plan, you want to make sure that it makes sense. And the reason I'm skipping it is because I'm just going to go down to this one here. So this is an example of a training plan. And what I have written down is we should have these every time we teach something new. Something new can be read as something in the FTU, or it can be read as teaching a pilot just that you're going out to fly with. New stuff, tactics-wise, but they're already CMRs. Okay, so this is a lesson plan for civilian flying, so you'll have to kind of associate it with RQ4 flying. But bottom line, you should start out with lesson objective. The student will learn to control for wind drift. In this case, the student will learn to collect with the Block 30 sensor, something like that. Completion standards. The student will demonstrate the ability to consistently control for wind drift in a safe and effective manner within the specified limit of heading, altitude, and airspeed. So, completion standards. The student should be able to effectively position the aircraft to collect with a Block 30 based on the wind drift and the photo regard and all the things, something like that. And then content. These are the things that we're going to talk about in the pre-brief. These are the things that we're going to go over because I need to make sure that you have a strong anchor on your building block approach, the building blocks, the anchor points, at the very foundational level that you understand these things that we've covered previously and I taught you, or you should have been taught by another instructor. But here are the things that you need to know to understand what we're about to learn today. Then go into an introduction about all the things. Here's how the Block 30 sensor works. Here's how you as a pilot need to control things. Here's what you need to focus on, things like that. And then actually going through the instruction and teaching it. And then post-flight discussion, which is going to be your debrief. Making sure that you discuss all the things they did well, they didn't do well, and associating it with the things that you taught them. We literally don't do this at all in the Air Force, and I've never not seen this in the civilian world. So I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm not saying it's good, but I would like you to take this back, kind of chew on it a little bit, and think about if every time you went out and taught someone, if you had a, let's say, I don't know, like a binder full of this shit to kind of figure out if you want to, what you want to teach when you go out and fly with someone, so that you just have to open this thing up and actually go over something that may be useful. And if all of you are wondering why I'm keeping secrets, it's because 123 me. I would not be at the WIC if I didn't step on every head I could to be successful and just fuck all my buddies so that I can be the one that is good. Let's see. Chapter 8.3 or page 8.3 is what we're going to now. And if anybody's got any questions, let me know. Chapter 7 is instructor responsibilities and professionalism. We're going to skip that because you guys already know all that stuff. 8. All right, chapter 8. Okay, techniques of flight instruction. Bottom line, this is where we start to talk about, this is the last chapter, by the way, so we'll be done here shortly. This is the chapter that actually discusses how to go about actually instructing people. And this, I'm laughing because this is literally not taught at all to anybody, except for we started teaching you guys a little bit about this in the weapons school. But it's funny to me because I'm just being an ass right now, because it's just ridiculous that we don't teach this to our pilots. But basically, it talks about different strategies on when to instruct, which phases. So before the flight, during the flight, and then after the flight, you'll see here, during the landing apparently, and then always. So this is key here, and this is something that I had to be reminded of during validation, is that you're always in a position where you can instruct. You're never not in a position where you don't have to, or you should be avoiding teaching someone something new. Because what you don't realize is that you may be that little tipping point, that little push that that person needed to want to go and discover more, to ask more questions, to figure out more information, and try to ask more questions to dig deeper and understand and increase their knowledge level. Instructors have a responsibility of producing the safest pilots as possible, and I would say safest and most tactical. That's going to be y'all's responsibility. And then there's obstacles of learning during flight instruction. And again, please follow me on this because this is very important. Obstacles to learning during flight instruction. Certain obstacles are common to flight instruction and may apply directly to the student's attitude, physical condition, and psychological makeup. These include, but are not limited to, feeling of unfair treatment, impatience to proceed to more interesting operations, worry or lack of interest, physical discomfort, illness, fatigue, dehydration, apathy due to inadequate instruction, and anxiety. So those are some things to kind of go over a little bit more detail. So unfair treatment. Students who believe their instruction is inadequate or that their efforts are not conscientiously considered and evaluated do not learn well. So if they think that you are just treating them like shit, or if you are, it's going to be a barrier for them actually retaining knowledge and actually wanting to be there with you. Impatience. Impatience is a greater deterrent to learning pilot skills than is generally recognized. For a student, this may take the form of a desire to make an early solo flight or to set out on a cross-country flights before basic elements of flight have been learned. This was me. I was this guy. I had been flying with my dad for about a year, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, I think. uh, I don't know, a while. And whenever I actually started officially learning how to fly, I had to go through the syllabus, go through the lesson plans before I could actually solo. But in my head, I had already done all those things. So I didn't want to sit there and have to be taught how to do all this stuff that I already knew. But I had to follow the rules and do the thing. But I was definitely an impatient student, which was very difficult for my instructors. Worry or lack of interest. Worry or lack of interest has a detrimental effect on learning. So students who are worried are emotionally upset or not ready to learn and derive little benefit from instruction. So this is something to keep in mind. If you have a student that's concerned about a check ride or if there's something going on in their life, it may be something to call terminate on, maybe knock it off and push them to a later flight. It's not worth pushing someone through a flight just to do it and removing that student's possibility of being more successful by having that flight back at a better emotional time. So, regardless of how you feel about politically correctness and people's like brains and how they function, you as an instructor have to actually think about how people are using their brain and what they're actually thinking about to ensure that they are successful. And then physical discomfort, illness, fatigue, and dehydration. This goes back to those basic fundamental needs, the pyramid that we talked about yesterday. If those guys don't have those basic needs met and they're worried about if they're going to have toilet paper tomorrow, then they may not be focused on actually learning. They may be worried about actually getting those things they need to be happy and survive, to get that comfort for them. Let's see. And then fatigue. So if you have a student that is like very tired, fatigue is one of the most treacherous hazards to flight safety, as it may not be apparent to a pilot until serious errors are made. So if you have a student that is, just not getting enough sleep, if they're hoboing it out in 107, things like that, that will cause detriment to their training, their education, and their performance. So if you notice a student is having trouble with fatigue, then it may be worth having a conversation with them, talking about why that's occurring, and trying to actually figure out how you can help alleviate the problems that may be causing the fatigue. Now, obviously, fatigue is different for everyone, and it can be caused by multiple different things, but it's worth having the conversation to figure out where the underlying issue is. Acute fatigue is characterized by inattention, distractibility, errors in timing, neglect of secondary tasks, loss of accuracy and control, lack of awareness and error accumulation, and irritability. So there's lots of different forms of fatigue to keep in mind. So it doesn't affect everyone the same way, but it definitely affects everyone. And then dehydration and heat stroke. If you're having a heat stroke in the MCE, God help you. But outside of that, dehydration, making their drinking and getting everything together, just keeping their body good. And then apathy due to inadequate instruction. And I put ISR support to question mark. Students can become apathetic when they recognize that the instructor has made inadequate preparations for instruction being given, or when the instruction appears to be deficient, contradictory, or insincere. So if you have an instructor, or if you as an instructor are just like, oh, I don't want to teach this, I'm just going to play a YouTube video, that is an example of something that may cause apathy due to inadequate instruction. Just an example like that. So don't be that guy. Anxiety is another good one. I say good one. It's another big one to kind of keep in mind. Students' anxiety may place additional burdens on the instructor. This frequently limits the student's perceptive ability and retards the development of insights. The student must be comfortable, confident in the instructor and the aircraft, and at ease and effective if effective learning is to occur. So if you have a student that is concerned about something or is just overall has something on his mind, his or her mind, you need to take a step back and figure out if it's something that you can actually alleviate or not. It may be a case of they just have anxiety, period, and that's just their type of personality, and you may have to fight through it. But anxiety is probably one of the bigger barriers to instruction and learning that you'll run into, I believe, in my opinion, based on what I've seen. Demonstration performance training delivery method. You have probably used this most likely. Bottom line, there's different possibilities of actually teaching someone. Remember, we're in the teaching chapter on how you can instruct. The demonstration performance training delivery method was discussed in chapter 4 apparently. but the following in-depth discussion is geared toward the flight instructor. So there's an explanation phase, a demonstration phase, student performance with instructor supervision, and then evaluation. So the flight instructor needs to be well prepared and highly organized if complex maneuvers and procedures are to be taught effectively. So you need to go through and explain to the student exactly what's going to occur, exactly what you're going to do, and how it should look whenever you perform the maneuver. This can be doing ad hocs, this can be turning the airplane, this can be giving go-tos, whatever. It's a little bit more difficult to focus too much on this for the RQ4, but we do actually perform this while instruction. Demonstration phase, the instructor must show the student the actions necessary to perform a skill. So this is important. If you have a student that doesn't understand how to do a thing, then they will need you to teach them how to do it. So you may need to demonstrate it to them. And then student performance and instructor supervision phases. So this is normally, I think, where we actually sit in the RQ4 world, which is we're sitting next to our student, they're doing the things, and we're supervising. So that's essentially how it goes down for most part for us. And then the evaluation phase, which is I saw you do the thing, this is how you did, this is how you can be better. Bottom line, that's essentially what that's talking about. And then there's more information on the telling do method, where the instructor explains what he's going to do, and then he does it. But again, a lot of this is difficult for us in some areas because we're not physically flying the aircraft, so it's a little different for us. A lot of our information is cerebral. So one of the areas that I found as a CFI that I used, and also just in the RQ4 in general, the student tells, instructor does. So this is, in my opinion, a great technique for struggling students. So if you have a student that's just not doing well, having a lot of issues, what I found is if you are sitting in the seat and you're at the controls or the mouse and keyboard, if you have the student tell you what they want you to do because you're trying to make sure they understand what they need to do, what it does is it removes them from having to click all the buttons and worry about all the stress, and it allows them to tell you what to do and understand that they may lack the understanding of what they need you to do. And it gives you areas of understanding of where that student's brain is and how they're functioning to know where you can teach them to be better. So if the student has difficulty telling you to do something as you are flying and they're sitting next to you, then it starts to give you an idea of where to focus your instruction. I find this most useful for struggling students because it gives you an idea of what's going on in their head. Because if they can't explain to you how to give a go-to, if they can't explain to you where you're going to look for a certain product or how you're going to use it or things like that, then you understand where to focus on and why they themselves are not doing it while they're flying. So that's a really good technique in my opinion. Then the student tells, student does. This is really kind of an instructor thing, but this is for a man flying thing in my opinion. But you can still try and get your student to do that as well, and maybe it'll be successful. I've never actually used it too much, but I will have the student explain to me sometimes what they're doing while they're doing it, just so I can understand what's going on. And so inherently using that technique, but it's not intentional. And then there's the positive exchange of flight controls, which we don't really focus too much on because we can physically see who's flying and who's not. And then moving on to the sterile cockpit rule. For sterile cockpit, basically it's defined in the rules for FAA, the CFRs, and the what you call these? I forgot what those are called at this point. Code of Federal Regulations, right there. Basically, they define it as operations below 10,000 feet or in cruising flight or involving taxi, takeoff, landing, or all other operations. What I recommend in the RQ4 is anytime you have a checklist open, it is a sterile cockpit. And the reason for that is if you have a checklist open, you're doing a task. If you're doing a task, you don't want to be saturated with extra information that you're not focusing on or you're not worried about at the time. So if you have an open checklist, you shouldn't be just kind of chatting it up. You should be focusing on what you're actually doing and putting all of your brain power towards that task. That'll save you in the future in case something occurs. Okay, another technique is use of distractions. I live here. This is my life. If any of you have ever been my student while we're flying, I can tell you that I've used this on you. Sorry. What it basically is if you have a student who's flying, you can slowly kind of throw little things out there to try and distract them, to try and make sure that they focus on actual flying and less on the distractions. And this is important because when shit hits the fan and Merc's blowing up and everybody's calling your phone, if you couldn't deal with me asking you a simple question while I'm sitting next to you, then I know that you're not going to be able to fly the aircraft in the event of a catastrophic event. So an example of what that may look like, instructor responsibilities include teaching the student to divide his or her attention between the distracting task and maintaining control of the aircraft. Drop a pencil, ask the student to pick it up. Ask the student to determine a heading to an airport using a chart, which they would have to fly the aircraft and do at the same time. Ask the student to reset the clock. Ask the student to get something from the back seat. Yes, all these are asshole things that instructors are taught to do in the CFI world. I heard stories of an evaluator giving a check ride who was screaming at a student, pick the pencil up, pick the pencil up, pick the pencil up, because he was trying to cause the student to, they were in a critical phase of flight. They were turning base to final, and the evaluator was screaming at him to pick up a pencil, and he wanted them to focus on landing and not worried about picking up a pencil. Quite possibly the most asshole thing I've ever heard, but I use this pretty often. What I'll do is I will have, what is it? I think that I can't even remember now, so it's been so long since I used it, but it has to do with turning. Sterile cockpit while turning and actually turning by a certain point. And so what I'll do is I'll have the student work with the sensor operator and develop a game plan on how they're going to turn around, how close they're going to get to a border, when they're going to slew, all those things. And I'll wait till about maybe a minute and 30 seconds, 2 minutes prior, and I will just spark up a really interesting conversation. And what it does is it completely collapses their CRM, like almost entirely. The only person who actually pays attention I've seen is the sensor operator. And I think every time I've done it, the sensor operator's been laughing because I think they know what I'm doing. So that's been pretty funny to see. But the pilot is oblivious, and they will fail and not do every single thing that I've asked them to do. And that's my favorite one, personally. Roxanne said, I like student tells, student does, with more experienced students that are getting closer to iPugs so that I can gauge their instructor abilities. It's also good during evals to have an idea of the student's thought process. Yep, that's good info. Thanks, Roxanne. All right, so assessment of pilot ability. As you can see, guys, I'm skipping some different areas in here, and it's not because I don't think they're relevant to you. It's because I don't think it's relevant for me to teach you right now. They're good info that you can go read in your book there, and we're almost done here shortly. The assessment of the piloting ability is an essential component of teaching process. Bottom line, being able to grade the student or rate them in some way and then giving that to them in a debrief. There's the demonstrated ability. Assessment of demonstrated ability during flight instruction, must be based upon established standards of performance. Again, you want to make sure that they are meeting the standards that you set for them, and they need to demonstrate to you that they can meet those standards. Post-flight evaluation and assessing and piloting ability is important for the flight instructor to keep the student informed of progress. This is going to be your debrief. So whenever you go with a student, it should never be, hey, you got anything for me? No. You got anything for me? No. Sweet. Let's get out of here. Cool. That debrief was 6 seconds. So it's going to be a culture shock for us, for sure, as RQ4. But I've never been in a community, to include civilian, where the pilot and the crew did not debrief what occurred, ever. I've never seen that not happen except the RQ4. So more time needs to be spent actually focusing on talking about where the errors are and fixing it in a debrief. And then let's see, correction of student errors. Correction of student errors should not include the practice of immediately taking the controls away when a mistake is made. Okay, so when I was a CFI, I was horrible at this. I had a student that I very much remember. We were at Ruston, Louisiana Airport, Ruston International Airport, which is just like a dirt strip. It used to be, at least. And the student was having trouble lining up with the runway. And so every time he would get out of alignment, I would say, I have the aircraft, and I would realign him, because all I wanted him to do was to just keep alignment on the runway that I gave him so that we could go down and try and land. And he was incapable of maintaining alignment. Now, there's a lot of schools of thought on here, and I actually had a conversation with our lead instructor pilot about it, because that student eventually quit the program, because he was determined to be a shitty pilot, or he was going to be a shitty pilot, I guess. But so maybe I wasn't too bad off on that. But bottom line, I let it go as far as I could to where I felt unsafe when there's like 5 planes in the pattern and I don't want him flying towards another plane. But specifically, I would definitely take the controls and fix it almost immediately if there was a concern there for safety. And when you're also in the plane, there's probably a little bit more concern for you you having some skin in the game of an accident occurring. But when it comes to the RQ-4, I'll just let it ride. As long as we don't break into somebody's country and start a war, I'll just let it go and just let them talk about it and have them correct it themselves. But I've actually never had to take the controls, and I don't plan on doing it unless there's a catastrophic event occurring. But don't be that guy that just corrects every single time. Give the student some leeway to recognize the mistake and fix it themselves, because it gives them the ability to start building their essay bubble. If you fix it every time, that'll start to degrade their self-esteem, and then learning will slowly deteriorate from there. Pilot supervision. Flight instructors have the responsibility to provide guidance and restraint with respect to the solo operations of their students. So I don't think we're going to be doing any of that, but I can tell you from experience that soloing a student is the most stressful thing on God's green earth, relatively speaking, to aviation, because you are the only human on earth that taught this other human how to fly an airplane, and then you get out of that airplane and they go take off, and as soon as they get off the ground, there's nothing you can do except stand there on a picnic table with a radio in your hand praying to God that they land the aircraft. So that is a very concerning time for me. It all turned out in the end. And then I think we're getting into the last bits here. Yep. So the last few things I have highlighted here: aeronautical decision making. Bottom line, that's just the ability to fly the aircraft, talk on Merc, check spec view, do the things, work with CRM with your sensor operator all at the same time. During that process, you need to slow down and actually make decisions that make sense and figure out what's important and what's not important at the time. So if you have a student who's just slowly focusing on Merc the entire time and not really focusing on the collection, then their decision making is poor and they need to be helped out. Defining the problem. The first step in decision making is defining the problem, figuring out what you're actually trying to fix. And then a problem is perceived first by its senses and then distinguished by thoughtful insight, through insight and experience. So I would say defining the problem for us is a little more about figuring out where there's a delay or where there's a lag in information, or flight operations, if you will. And this is the decision-making process. Choose a course of action. So after the problem has been identified, the pilot evaluates the need to react to it and determines the actions that may be taken to resolve the situation within the time available. And then from there, it moves on, implement the decision and evaluate the outcome. So bottom line, I believe this is really called the OODA loop now, the Boyd OODA loop. So really that's just what that is. Then there's factors that affect decision making, and then one of the big ones is hazardous attitudes. I don't know if you guys have heard of this before, but they're the 5 hazardous attitudes: anti-authority, like don't tell me what to do, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and then resignation. Impulsivity, do it quickly. Invulnerability, it won't happen to me. Macho, I can do it. And then resignation, what's the point? Why am I even doing this? I don't care. Like, kind of apathetic. These are real. And when you identify these of your student, I would highly advise you to call terminate, and to have the discussion. Because if you have people like this, I think the biggest one I've seen is macho and invulnerability. I've seen those in man flying. Invulnerability, I watched some guys fly to Houston while a hurricane was just barreling through there, and I had to watch that entire thing unfold. Thankfully, everybody was fine and they landed before the hurricane successfully, but that's one of those things that may be concerning. Macho, I can do it. I've seen that many a times. I myself, I think I've done that a few times as well. Cassie Marshall actually called me out on that one time, I think, because I told her that I would be willing to take a bacon up on MRSAT, and I still would be willing to do that. So I don't think that was macho. I think that was just me just doing my job. Um, and then, yeah, so there's 5 hazardous attitudes. So there's antidotes associated with those. So macho, taking chances is foolish. Anti-authority, follow the rules, they're usually right. And vulnerability, it could happen to me. Impulsivity, not so fast, think first. And then resignation, I'm not helpless, I can make a difference. So I would advise you guys to actually look at these. I would say you can look at them in the book or maybe Google them to see if there's any more relevant information. But it's definitely important info, and it does matter when it comes to working with students. There's also stressors that can affect pilot performance, physical, psychological, and physiological. So go through those and have a look at those and see what you can find. Yeah, MRSAT. Uh, there's different resources for stress management. The Air Force actually provides a shit ton of resources for us to use if you guys are not aware. And I think that I actually have something that I can drop into the chat for you guys that I'm not sure if it was given out or not, but it's some resources that you guys can use to if you need it in case something is occurring in your life where you kind of need some help. I'll get that sent out to you guys. I was looking at it yesterday. Okay, cool. And then there's workload management. All this stuff is stuff that you already know. And this last bit, I think it's just like one thing that I found here. Yeah, it's just this one thing. I didn't want to go too far into risk management because we all fill out ORM. We all talk about that and we all know what that looks like. But there's an actual entire chapter that discusses risk management. And I can promise you that none of this has been taught to a single pilot in the RQ4 except for maybe a few people. Because you get a new pilot, they just come in and you say, "Oh, fill out your ORM," and they're like, "Oh, okay. Well, what do I put?" So I don't know. How do you feel? Oh, great. Oh, it's a 0, and that's really kind of the baseline. But really, you should kind of take a step back and figure out what this actually means. And this will probably be more relevant to you guys as OPSUPs, I would think, more than anything else. Risk is defined as the probability of possibility of severity of accident or loss from exposure to various hazards, including injury to people or loss of resources. And then there's different types of risk here, which they're all pretty, it's pretty obvious, but something that still needs to be discussed at least once the first time so that everyone's on the same page. So you guys should look at that. It's that figure 9.1 on 9 TAC 2 there. And I believe that is everything that I wanted to teach you guys. Again, there's a lot of good info. Yep, here's one last thing. This is the very last thing I wrote on here. Okay, operational pitfalls. This is under risk management. A few things that you can actually take a step back and look at to determine areas where there can be problems for your pilots. One thing that you'll see with us, probably in the WIC, I think is probably we're guilty of, is get their itis, but from an LNO perspective. I want you guys to fly that jet up here, and I don't care if it crashes on the way or it flies through icing, things like that. So that can be something that we can be guilty of from peer pressure because we have a mindset to do all the things. Yeah, let me just sit here and go through and call us out on stuff. But there's a lot of different things here that can talk about risk and things that can be pitfalls for you. I have Scud running here because I'm not going to talk about it, but I can say that I've seen what that looks like. Essentially, the pilot maintains visual contact with the terrain at low altitudes while instrument conditions exist. So imagine if you're flying and you're 500 feet off the ground because that's legally what you're required to be at, and the clouds are just right above you, but they're legally required to be above you at a distance. And as they lower, you get lower because you have to be so far from the clouds and you don't want to not see the ground. And eventually, everybody lowers enough to where you're scud running. And let's put it this way. People that scud run take a risk in trying to get where they're trying to go, maybe a certain airport somewhere. and they are trying to get there, but they don't want to actually fly in the weather for some reason because it's easier to just go visually, and they take this risk. I've been put in that position more times than I care to admit. So anyway, that's a fun story for another time in a skiff when no one can record me and play it back for some other people. Down, down, down. Yep, I think that's it, guys. I don't have anything else for you. Cool. That's an hour and a half. That's all I got. Do you guys have any questions on anything? Anything you'd like me to recap or talk about again? In your experience with lesson plans, was the plan made available to the studs before the event, or was it introduced during the lesson? All that is available, Mega, before the lesson. Essentially, you create it and you want to give your student the capability of understanding what's actually going to occur. So imagine just walking into something blind and not knowing what you're going to do as a student. It kind of sucks, but if you know ahead of time what's going to occur, you have an idea of what to prepare for, what to study up on, what you want to focus on. So every time I've seen it, a student has always had access to the lesson plan ahead of time so that they know what they're going to be doing so they can prepare for it. All right. Can you guys just type no questions if you don't have anything, or if you got something, just type it up for me. I don't want to sit here and stare in silence if you guys don't got anything else for me. Um, Big picture, guys, with all this stuff, it's information that instructors should have been taught a long time ago. Um, and you're just now getting it, which is fine. But I want you to keep in mind that this information exists. You guys have access to it, and you can relate it more to yourselves and your crews whenever you get back, because as the weapons officer, you're supposed to be the lead instructor pilot for your guys and gals. And so I'm not saying take this book and make them read it, but I am saying take some concepts from this book and make it available for your crews so that they can be successful should they choose to try and improve themselves. Outside of that, guys, I definitely would like some feedback on these lessons. If this is something that you would like me to teach in future classes, something that you think would be useful down the road, things like that, let me know so I can try and make that available. It's something that should be taught at a baseline level, but if it's something that you guys are learning just now, then that means that, which I already know this, that there's a lack of knowledge and information available about this to our instructors as they're going through IPUG. So at least we can hit our WIC instructors as they're coming through the WIC to make sure that they understand these concepts and things that they can do. All right, gents, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. Make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and peace.